Halo Combat Evolved's second mission, simply titled Halo, was arguably the most important in the game. After the tight, winding corridors of the Pillar of Autumn, getting you to grips with the basic controls and combat loop, you emerge from the lifeboat to a scene that every other YouTuber has already described. You come out and you see the ring, you see the light, you're on the ring, it's this thing, you're there, it's cool, yeah, we got it. The game now expects you to take those controls that you've learned and apply them in the core Halo tenets. Battles with diverse aliens in a variety of small and large-scale battles, on vast, expansive natural environments, on an artificial alien world and infrastructure. And no moment establishes this more than this scene. Once all the waves are finished at the Tower Wave Defense, we're shipped off to go search for more survivors, and we get our first look at one of the vehicles in Halo, the Warthog. The Warthog is one of Halo's most enduring symbols, almost as iconic as the Chief himself. It's another contrast to the cramped hallways of the Pillar of Autumn, that these maps are going to be vast enough that faster transport is necessary for exploration. Vehicles end up being a fairly sizable component of the game, and I think it lends itself to an interesting discussion on the nature of genre theory in video games, as the Warthog changed Halo's genre, in more ways than one. First of all, what is genre? Well, it's a complex and evolving topic, one of those things that everyone knows, but no one quite fully understands. Dr. Amy DeWitt puts it in writing genres as,
genre exists through people's individual rhetorical actions at the nexus of the context of situation, culture, and genres.
Professor Aaron Flugfielder simplifies it as,
genre is the name we use to describe the categories that have developed over time for what we read, what we watch, and what we listen to.
And American cultural critic Daniel Schlur articulates it as,
when you see a friend walking down the street and you see that guy's wearing a Slayer shirt too, you can literally, you can deal.
You know what?
You know that you're thinking,
Everyone knows that Halo is a first-person shooter. I mean, it's undeniable. It's in first person, and you shoot many of things. The entire first level is basically set up to teach you how to play Halo, the first-person shooter, on a console. But I think you can make an argument that it is sometimes a third-person shooter, as when you hop into a vehicle, the camera switches as such. You could even go all in and say it's a third-person driving game sometimes, as the majority of time spent in vehicles is in the Warthog, which has no shooting options available for the driver. I'd estimate that a good 10 to 20% of the time playing Halo is spent in vehicles. But even with that, if you pitched it as a third-person driving game to someone, that would probably be considered false advertising. At the very least, you might get called fucking stupid. Partially it might be because, as it is, vehicle sections in FPS games switching to a third-person scheme is commonplace now, in no small part due to Halo's influence. But it also comes down to how the terminology of common game genres are formed. This is a tricky field to navigate. There is an ongoing debate in game studies described as narratology versus ludology. Whether or not games should be 1. Approached using narrative genre theory as has been developed in regards to traditional media like novels or film, narratology. 2. Analyzed solely through its mechanisms and systems as a piece of interactive media, ludology. Or 3. A hybrid approach of both, bothology. Omega Thorion simplifies it in their essay on this dichotomy as,
a narratologist would say that Halo is a game about space aliens, whereas a ludologist would say that Halo is a game about shooting and combat.
It's fairly easy to combine the two descriptively and say Halo is a game about shooting space aliens, which would be the ludonarrative way to describe it, a term that if you've been around the block you no doubt just rolled your eyes at. But it still doesn't broach the question of its genre. The word genre itself is a fairly nebulous term, and often combines elements of narrative, form, media, and mode. The situations and context as described by DeWitt. In video games, narrative modes, in particular perspective and point of view, are often a more vital piece of information to convey when describing them, as opposed to, say, novels and films, which almost exclusively focus on setting and form. For example, Alien is a science fiction horror film. The Lord of the Rings is a high fantasy novel. Describing The Lord of the Rings as a third-person omniscient view novel is unnecessarily long and doesn't convey enough relevant information about it as a general category or recommending it to someone. But on the flip side, calling StarCraft a science fiction game is not enough information to convey what the experience of playing it is like. It's what Wolf describes in Chapter 6 of The Medium of the Video Game as iconography versus interactivity. Both Halo and StarCraft are science fiction games with military themes as their iconography, but their different perspectives affect their interactivity and systems in such a profound way that it warrants them being placed into entirely different genre categories. Though it's funny to say that about Halo and StarCraft, as Halo as a first-person shooter owes its entire existence to the Warthog. It's fairly well known that during the earlier stages of development, Halo was originally going to be an RTS, exclusive to Mac. The Warthog was one of the original units created for the game. One of the staff members created a node that allowed the camera to follow a specific unit, one driving a Jeep, and over time, the camera ended up being moved closer and closer until Bungie thought it would just be much more fun to just drive the car itself. The game then shifted to a third-person control scheme, which over the years of developing random gameplay elements, the acquisition by Microsoft, and the need to push the game to meet a shipping deadline for the Xbox, further became a first-person shooter. It seems that third person was decided as the best course to keep for the vehicles, which I think was a smart decision because first-person driving tends to be a little... The fact that these two shifts in perspective changed its genre not once, but twice, is a really fascinating part of video games as a whole. If The Lord of the Rings had instead been rewritten before publication to be in first person, it would have an undeniably different experience and feel, but it wouldn't have been a big enough shift to warrant calling it an entirely different genre. It would still just be called a high fantasy novel. Or if a film was reshot to be entirely from a first-person point of view, the effect would be even more drastic and different, but the result would be the same. Such as Hardcore Henry, where though the unbroken POV is usually one of the first things mentioned about the film, its genre is usually just categorized as comedy action. Halo was always going to be a science fiction action game, but Halo the first-person shooter and Halo the third-person shooter would have been in fundamentally different categories, let alone Halo the RTS, or even Halo the driving game. But even so, is Halo the first-person shooter enough to convey its experience? Even ignoring the parts that aren't in first person, such as vehicles, cutscenes, and when you perish, using the ludological approach to describe Halo the first-person shooter as a game where you shoot space aliens is still a vast simplification. It's also a game where you walk, jump, crouch, look around familiar and unfamiliar environments, listen to dialogue, activate buttons, reload, swap between weapons, drop weapons, pick up weapons from the ground, turn a flashlight off and on, punch, bludgeon with a weapon, and lob grenades. In fact, it's entirely possible to go through the entire game without firing a single bullet. When Frogarchist finished the game without shooting, for that playthrough, did Halo stop being a first-person shooter game? I'd probably say no, but these are the kind of thought experiments that show the fluidity and rhetoric of genre and medium. If you only listen to the audio of a television show, does it become a radio play? If you watch a movie without sound and the subtitles on, does it become a silent film? Again, I'd probably say no, but it doesn't stop me from doing it every time I'm on a flight watching over someone's shoulder because I ain't paying $15 to watch Aquaman 3 The Wettening. Despite all these things you can do in the game, and despite the fact that you can avoid it with some hassle, shooting is undoubtedly the focus and intention, which leads it to be considered necessary to put in the genre name. This is a subtle thing, but it permeates through game genres and naming conventions. Left 4 Dead is unequivocally a first-person shooter. Every website I could find lists it as such. But that's not the case with Vermintide, a game that clearly follows in Left 4 Dead's footsteps, to the point of being called a Left 4 Dead clone. Vermintide is in first person, and is a game where you can shoot, but your primary weapon and method of attack for all characters is a melee weapon, and even the ranged focus characters have it in the secondary slot. And as such, it's far more consistently referred to as a first-person action game, Which makes sense. Calling Vermintide an FPS feels a little off, a little wrong, you know? But in much the same vein, calling Halo a first-person action game also feels a little off, despite the fact it's not wrong. Halo is in first person, and it is an action game, but it just feels not right, you know? Now, like with all things genre, this naming convention is not a universal truth. The Resident Evil series features games in a myriad of different perspectives, from cinematic tank controls, third person to first person. But almost all of the games are primarily listed and categorized under survival horror, perhaps as a way to hold cohesion and consistency in grouping the series together, and also because perspective is not as necessary as a descriptor as to what you primarily do in these games. And even that can be argued in its own capacity, as the number of games that skew closer to action is almost a 50-50 split. Perhaps if Halo had more variety and perspective in its mainline entries, it too would have its own umbrella genre, perhaps sci-fi action, like on this original promotional image for Halo back in 2000 when it was a third-person game still. Maybe? I don't know, my dad works at Bungie, so he might tell me, you know, yeah. At any rate, vehicles are a big component of the secret sauce of Halo in my opinion. Rather than feeling tacked on or like an unnecessary change of mode or genre, the vehicle sections add to the core gameplay loop. Part of what makes the shift in perspective, and potentially genre, feel fluid and barely drawing any attention to itself, is that the Warthog moves using almost the exact same controls as on foot. You use the right analog stick/mouse to look and steer, and the left stick/WASD to move, minus strafing and accounting for acceleration and friction and all that fucking nerd shit. And firing from the back weapon uses the same trigger as firing a gun. At this stage of the game, you're fighting the same enemies in the same formation: elites, jackals, grunts, and although later on we will see some of the Covenant's own vehicles, it ultimately just feels like another component of the sandbox, a big gun on wheels. The camera transition between first and third person is pretty smooth as well, and I'm never taken out of the experience when it happens. Perhaps it's this smoothness that ultimately distracts you from the fact that it is fundamentally changing its narrative mode. Mode and perspective switches aren't uncommon in other media either. No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy switches between third and first person through some of Sheriff Bell's stream of consciousness narration. And the camera very often goes in first person when seeing through the eyes of John Malkovich, in the mind-bending and thought-provoking late 90s classic starring John Cusack and the titular John Malkovich, Con Air. The content doesn't shift with these mode shifts. No Country doesn't become a campy road comedy, and Being John Malkovich doesn't become a historical drama. These mode shifts occur to best convey the experience of the content in the moment. Driving the Warthog in Halo in third person is much the same. And this all comes down to what Arsenal states is the ultimate function of genre: communication. As he puts it,
genre in games is the codified usage of particular mechanics and game design patterns to express a range of intended play experiences.
just as it is unnecessary to mention the POV shots in Being John Malkovich, it's unnecessary to use third-person driving when categorizing and communicating the general experience of Halo. Calling Halo a first-person shooter communicates far better what the game is about than a third-person driving game. And what is important to communicate changes over time. It took years to shake the term Doom clone, particularly because, well, a lot of games did ape Doom, but also because it was important to communicate that the game was like Doom. This continues into today with like genres, roguelikes, souls-likes, literally like Rogue, like Dark Souls. And even with FPS, the rise of the term boomer shooter is a necessary subgenre, because first-person shooter games have evolved and changed so much over the years that it's necessary to convey the differences in mechanical experiences. Call of Duty, Battlefield, or Titanfall do not play the same as Dusk, Ultra Kill, or Cultic. Halo is not the first game to mix different perspectives, nor even the first FPS. Hostages, released in 1988, had similar transitions between third and first person. But Halo is definitely not a Hostages-like. Hostages is generally classified as a tactical shooter. And this is where another component of communication comes in: prior in-group knowledge. If you don't play video games, just hearing first-person shooter versus third-person shooter versus tactical shooter wouldn't be enough to understand the intricacies of their differences. You could make an inference based on some of the words, but without an innate understanding of their usage, you would need a detailed explanation or exposure to really understand. But to someone enfranchised in gaming in general, first-person shooter is enough to tap into your prior experience and get the gist. And the further you are enfranchised in a subculture, the more you can tap into. And this is why calling Vermintide 2 a first-person shooter, or Halo a first-person action game, though technically correct, feels functionally and spiritually wrong. For the vast majority of gamers, at least for categorization, calling Halo a first-person shooter is the best way to talk about it, to communicate its general experience. People's individual rhetorical actions, meeting at the nexus of the contexts of situation, culture, and genres. Or, you just know that you know. If Halo didn't have the Warthog, or the Ghost, or the Tank, or the Banshee, then this conversation on Halo the first-person shooter wouldn't exist. But then again, if Halo didn't have the Warthog, then Halo the first-person shooter itself wouldn't exist. So we should thank the Warthog for helping launch a game so interesting, so fun, so genre-defying and genre-defining, so full of interplaying mechanics and systems, and sentimentally so near and dear to my heart, that it can even get us thinking about this kind of thing in the first place. Now, if only the Warthog itself was just fucking easier to drive.